How's it going, ladies and gentlemen? My name is Rowlett and welcome to a brand new video. Now, as you may know, Ash Ketchum has been around for quite a long time in the Pokemon universe. He's been the main character of the anime for several years, and he's gone through several regions over the course of that time. Now, today I thought we'd take a look at Ash's teams, and of course we're going to take a look at Ash's worst Pokemon for each region / generation. As we know, Ash has a lot of really good Pokemon, but also quite a few Pokemon that aren't up to par and don't always help out a lot and do lose most of their battles. So keep in mind as you're watching this video, this is strictly based on facts and also slightly on my opinion, because sometimes I had to choose between two Pokemon and I had to go with my opinion or my gut feeling because both Pokemon were equally as bad. So please keep that in mind. This is based strictly on my opinion. I do not hate any of these Pokemon. I'm just kind of counting them down here. I don't hate any of these Pokemon. I'm strictly just making a video about this to go through the ones that are arguably the worst ones from Ash's teams. Now, let's get started. So, for the first season and region of Pokemon, we have Kanto, and in Kanto we got to meet Ash and his first team for the first time. And to begin with, we have ourselves Pidgeotto as the worst Pokemon, and yes, you may start freaking out, but please do remember that I'm not hating on any of these Pokemon, but rather I'm just pointing out the arguably worst Pokemon from certain generations. And Pidgeotto has to be the worst one from Kanto, and this has to do with the fact that when Pidgeotto was used, the few times that it ended up being used, it wasn't really that useful for the first few gyms and the areas that he was used in, but shortly after that it was totally out of the story and barely used at all anymore. Like, that's really the issue. Like, this Pokemon is barely around, which honestly is really disappointing, as it could have had a bigger impact and it ended up not having any. So that's really the biggest issue with Pidgeotto. It was a Pokemon that was useful in general. It could have been more useful, and it could have been, it could have had, rather, a bigger impact on the story, but it didn't. It was kind of put on the sideline. They didn't really use Pidgeotto much, and it was essentially a Pokemon that was wasted, in my opinion. It could have been way more handy to have it around, but it ended up just being a flopped Pokemon that wasn't that useful in the long run, so to say. But that's that, and I can't really argue about that too much anymore, but I've got to say, it could have been used way better, but it didn't end up being used that much, so that's that. But either way, let's go to the next one on the list. Now, next up is the Orange Islands. Now, I decided to keep the Orange Islands as a separate area because, or a separate, rather, generation, region, whatever you want to call it. Not really a generation, but rather its own separate thing, as it was a pretty long running, season and whatnot. So, for the Orange Islands, it comes down to really saying that it is Snorlax, and it has to be the worst one. This is mainly due to the fact that it doesn't really do much. Like, it is powerful, yes, Snorlax is powerful. The times that it does do something, it is really useful, but other times, it really isn't, and the usefulness of this Pokemon is beyond non-existent. Like, it just doesn't exist because it just falls asleep most of the time, and it just sleeps through most battles. Like, that's literally what Snorlax only does, and that's the whole meme and joke about Snorlax. It just sleeps, that's all it does. And the same thing happens in the Orange Islands, and it ends up being the least useful Pokemon in Ash's team in the Orange Islands due to the fact that it just sleeps through most battles. So, that's why it's on this list, and that's why it is the worst Pokemon from the Orange Islands that Ash owned. Let's go to the next one. Now, for Gen 2, we have Totodile. Let's just say Totodile is cute, adorable, and a badass Pokemon, let's be fair. But Ash's Pokemon, or rather Ash's Totodile, is bloody useless. Now, Totodile barely does anything for Ash and for the team, and the time that Ash actually uses Totodile, it mostly loses, and it's truly sad, as I do find that Totodile could have been a very useful Pokemon for Ash, especially if it was evolved, because it is one of the coolest Pokemon from Johto, in my opinion. It is one of the coolest looking starter Pokemon as well, as when it evolves, it just turns full-on badass, but Ash never really does much with it, and it ends up just being a really lackluster Pokemon that he catches. Like, it's really not that useful. All the battles it's in, it pretty much loses, and the times that it does something good is very minimalistic compared to all the other Pokemon he had in Johto and Generation 2. It really is disappointing, as I thought Totodile could have a bigger impact. Now, is it cute? Yes. Is it there for the cute factor, the adorable factor, and the little badass factor that's a little crocodile? Sure, it's still kind of a cute Pokemon, a nice Pokemon. I still loved it in some of the Pokemon Generation 2 movies, or rather the Johto movies. I did like it there, but that doesn't make up for the fact that it is quite a useless Pokemon in a sense, and it really does hurt me to say that because I freaking love this thing and I wish it could have been better, but that's going to be that one. Let's go to the next one on the list. Now, Generation 3 was the generation where Ash caught the least amount of Pokemon, in which also essentially leads to a hard time choosing what would be the worst Pokemon. But looking at it, we have a lot of contenders, even though there are such a small amount of them. Amount of Pokemon that he had. Rather, we have a lot of contenders for the worst one, considering that that team was probably arguably one of the worst teams Ash had. Now, I have to say that Corphish is the worst out of them all, due to the fact of it losing way more than other Pokemon Ash's own team that also were really bad, like Glalie and Torkoal, who were pretty useless as well, but somehow Corphish was even worse than those Pokemon. It was just awful at times. And that's really the biggest issue. It was totally useless in a sense, considering that the amount of times that it loses doesn't make up for the amount of times it's won, or rather, you know, win, lose, draw, whatever you want to call it. It feels that, like, it could have been a better Pokemon. I feel like Corphish could have been a way better Pokemon if Ash had actually evolved it, because Corphish was rather useless and weak as a Pokemon when being Corphish. If it had been evolved, I feel like it could have been more useful, which it ended up not being, and that's why Corphish ends up being his worst Pokemon in Generation 3, due to the fact that it loses most of its battles, it doesn't really win much, and the losses are so much more than the wins, so it just overshadows something like Glalie and Torkoal, who are also pretty bad in consideration. When you think about it, they weren't the best things ever as well, but on the other hand, though, Corphish was just worse. Though, I will say, if it was evolved, it would have been better. I love Corphish. It is one of my favorite Hole-in Pokemon. And I do think that it could have done way more and way more useful, but it ended up being pretty useless, which is really disappointing, as I think it could have been just a beautiful Pokemon for Ash to have, especially if evolved. It would have been fantastic. But that didn't end up happening, which is really sad, but whatever. We can't really argue too much about that. Now, let's go to the next one on the list. Now, for Generation 4, we have Gibble. Yes, Gibble. Somehow this awesome dragon type ended up being pretty worthless. Now, I'm going to point out something else before we continue here, and that is that I was going to put Torterra here, but Torterra was actually useful prior to evolving into Torterra. Like, Turtwig was really useful. Okay, Turtwig was badass and really, really powerful, and just a perfect Pokemon. But once it evolved into Torterra, it just started losing more because it became slower and bigger and hunkier, and it just couldn't keep up, which is, you know, bad, but still, I think that I'd rather, you know, still give it credit because Turtwig was still useful, but I digress. Either way, we have to say that Gibble is the worst because, like most others, I was really excited that Gibble was part of Ash's team, and I really thought that it would evolve and become an epic Pokemon only to be rivaled by future Pokemon such as Greninja, and it's like badassness. But what I mean by that is essentially that, like, you know what I mean, like, Greninja is a badass Pokemon, and I thought that maybe Gibble, you know, being there prior to Greninja could have been like the Pokemon that we compared Greninja to because, you know, of the badassness, but it never happened, which was really disappointing. It never evolved and it never went anywhere. While using it, well, it just didn't do much. It was here and there, and it wasn't really part of like too many battles, and the few battles it was part of, it lost most of them, and it didn't really do much in those. And the worst part is it has to be that the fact that it was replaced, like, or rather, it wasn't replaced, but Gliscor was replaced by Gibble. And I loved Gliscor. It was a Pokemon that I personally loved, and I thought it was really, really useful. It was more useful in battles, but Gibble comes around, takes its spot essentially, and doesn't really do much to justify its position. Like, it really ends up being a useless Pokemon that doesn't compare to Gliscor, you know, when you look at it arguably here. So I've got to say this, Gibble was really, really disappointing more than anything. It had high expectations because it was a cool Pokemon that could have evolved into something badass, but it never happened, and instead we got a disappointing Pokemon that lost most of its battles, and the ones that I guess it won, I don't even know if it won any battles to be honest, but the ones that it actually did something in were minimalistic compared to the amount of times it actually ended up just losing or being useless. So I have to say Gibble is a really disappointing Pokemon. More than anything, it's just a disappointment, which I'm really sad about. But either way, let's go to the next one on the list. Now, Unova was an area that I thought Ash would probably take a turn for the right, as he had a lot of variation in his team, and it was interesting to see him change around what he was using. But there was one Pokemon that stood out to me as the worst, and it has to be Boulder, or whatever you want to call it. Even though I think the Boulder was useful at certain areas, for example, the Rock-type gym, it was very, very useful there. But other than that, it wasn't really a good Pokemon. Now, Pokemon in Unova that Ash owned were quite a lot. There was quite a lot of different ones. You could have even said that Scraggy was a bad Pokemon because it didn't really do much, and that's honestly the truth. It didn't really do much. But I personally find that Boulder was really just the worst one. It was useful in one area, but after that it just turned totally useless and it didn't really do anything beyond that. I do think that it had the potential if it was perhaps evolved into Gigalith, perhaps it would have done more and been a tad more useful, if you know what I mean. Like, it would have maybe done a bit extra, but that never happened, which is really disappointing, because I think it could have been more useful to Ash, but it did never happen, which is really disappointing, and it falls flat compared to the other Pokemon in Ash's Unova team, because his Unova team was really the biggest and best one in my opinion, or not best one, but rather one of the best teams he's had in the variation and combination of Pokemon he used, but that never ended up happening, and Boulder was just a useless Pokemon in comparison to the others, which is really disappointing. I think it could have done more, but that's that. Let's go to the next one on the list. So now we are in Generation 6 and Kalos, and now this is the hardest area to choose, as this has to be Ash's best team for sure. This was the most solid and well-balanced team that Ash has ever had, and if you compare it to any of his previous teams, this seriously is the most balanced team he's ever had, and that's why it's so hard to choose. You know, you got yourself Goodra that was perhaps not too strong, but it did not faint or lose battles that much. It was, you know, still useful somewhat. And you had Pokemon like Greninja that were badass and always useful, and definitely one of Ash's best Pokemon, if not the best Pokemon Ash has ever owned, and the strongest Pokemon he's ever owned. But you look at it arguably, and I think it has to be Noibat, or rather Noivern here, as the one that I think is the worst, and that has to do with the fact that it won battles here and there, but it seemed like it did lose more than it won, but it still was a great Pokemon. It had a lot of great battles. It took a lot of good choices, you know, from Ash to make this Pokemon good and useful. Noibat and Noivern were useful Pokemon. They were not useless. I'm gonna be honest here. Noivern was fantastic. I love Noivern, but if you compare to all the other Pokemon in Ash's teams, or in Ash's team rather, in, you know, specifically Kalos and Generation 6, I have to say Noivern was the worst one, due to the fact that I lost more battles than most of the other Pokemon in Ash's team, which is really disappointing to me to say, because I freaking love this thing, and I really wish it could have, you know, done even better, or, you know, not been the worst one, but it's so hard to choose, because this is Ash's smallest team. It's so hard to choose a Pokemon here to, you know, go with, which is really, really hard, but I'm gonna go with Noivern. I still love this Pokemon, and I still think it was useful. Like, compared to the other Pokemon on this list, this is a Pokemon that was actually better than probably all the other Pokemon on this list in comparison, because it was still useful somewhat, while the other ones on this list were mostly pretty much useless. Noivern was still useful, but just lost more than some of the other Pokemon on Ash's, you know, team in Kalos specifically. But either way, let's go to the next one on the list. Now, this is going to be a hard one, because we're in Alola and Generation 7, and this is really going to be hard because Generation 7 is still in the making. Like, Sun and Moon, the anime is still going on, but I have to argue that the worst Pokemon so far that we've seen has to be Rowlett. Now, I love Rowlett because, one, it is my mascot. I freaking love it. It's my mascot, it's my favorite Alola Pokemon, but damn, Ash has, like, a horrible Rowlett. Like, this thing, it's adorable. Yes, it is cute. I love it. It is just the cutest thing in the world, but it just sleeps all day. It's like Snorlax, but tiny and an owl, you know what I mean? It is just not that useful, or not that strong rather, in comparison to the other Pokemon. Now, I was thinking about putting Litten here, but then I realized Litten is actually slightly useful, while Rowlett just sleeps around or does dumb shit and acts really, really retarded most of the time, which is really adorable, cute. I get it, that's the whole point of Rowlett, but I feel like it could have done more in terms of battles. There are a few battles that it is, I guess, used, but it's arguably the worst one out of Ash's team in Sun and Moon so far. So far. We haven't seen the end yet. We haven't seen the continuation. We are not sure how much else we've got to go in that series. But my point is, it is arguably the worst one compared to the others we have. So that's going to be that, and that's going to be the end of the list, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you did enjoy this video, make sure to drop a like down below, subscribe for future videos. If you want to see more videos by me, just stick around and, you know, watch future videos that will be coming out. We're going to put up daily videos as usual. Thank you guys so much for watching, and bye bye, ladies and gentlemen.